Hello and thank you for joining. I'm Trevin Martin, the Senior Marketing Manager here at Cygilant. Today's webcast is Cygilant's 2018 Cybersecurity Survey results. Our speaker today is Neil Weitzel, Cygilant's Director of Security Research. Neil has over a decade of professional technology experience with in-depth experience working in a variety of IT roles, from user support to advising security managers. In addition to being an expert application penetration tester, Neil is also an experienced trainer. Outside of work, he's an active member of the security community, delivering lectures at DEF CON, OWASP, and local security meetups. He leads capture the flag teams in open competitions and develops software. As a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you do have questions as we go through, please use the Q&A tab of your GoToWebinar window, and we'll do our best to answer your questions at the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Neil. Neil, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Trevin. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope you're weathering this storm if you're on the East Coast. But yeah, so today we wanted to go through some of our survey results and present our infographic that we compiled that go along with the results from the survey. Little history here to begin with. So why do we do this survey? Effectively, what we're trying to do with this is kind of identify patterns in the security space that perhaps we can address with solutions, or perhaps we can help advise clients or potential clients around this kind of growing pitfalls or areas that need more maturing. Investigate some of the outliers where perhaps particular areas that may be blind spots to some companies or haven't been considered or addressed completely with solutions that are available to the industry. And really, it's just kind of an idea to investigate the threat landscape around some of the areas that the industry security space is seen at large. So before we get to the actual infographic, what I wanted to do is kind of give you a little information about this and kind of a few of the anomalies we saw within the survey. So we did survey 134 people responded. It was 23 questions. Really, these questions were geared around the infrastructure, some of the challenges or pitfalls these people in the space have faced, and what tools or implementation level they're at with regard to these areas. One of the biggest areas that we noticed in this space is that upper level management seems to be buying in on the idea that security and security programs and having an effective cybersecurity program is really necessary. What we've kind of deduced through this survey result is that this seems to be a lot around the policy support. So as you can see here, like, yes, we're seeing a lot more people saying that the C-level and board of directors, that type of level, totally fall in line with the idea that, you know, we need to have security services, we need to have mature security practices and all those good policies, but we're still seeing it being underfunded with regard to how we're actually addressing or implementing these policies. A lot of these companies still have just a few IT staff or security employees or IT people with some security responsibilities, or they'll feel like a particular percentage of the budget that's allocated in terms of resources or staffs or hires is kind of under dedicated to making sure the security policies are implemented in a programmatic or efficient manner. So the overall challenges that kind of articulate this a little bit further are, we're still seeing the inability to kind of dedicate time to some of these security practices that could revolve around not being able to hire the right staff, again, train them on up-to-date knowledge, making sure we have the right tools in place in terms of configuration and evaluating new tools that are emerging constantly. The other notable others, which kind of could fall into some of these other areas, are retaining the staff, having effective leadership around that staff, so we know that where we're going is the right direction, and keeping current with that knowledge, that same kind of training and staff knowledge management. So these all kind of come around that idea that we need to make sure that we're not just putting in place the correct policies and have the right best practices in terms of compliance, but we're also allocating the necessary resources to making sure that we can see them through or implementing them in an efficient manner. So where we noticed, one of the areas that we'll talk about on the actual infograph is a majority of the people still feel not very confident about their solutions, or somewhat confident to that degree of implementation that they're going to resist a potential breach in their data. So what are the things that we're trying to protect, or where do we feel like we're most concerned with losing this data? The high most people are very concerned about their employees' data, but you can see a lot of these other areas are, around our IP and like consumer data, things that are applications are operating on. And this kind of backs into the regulations that oversee these areas. Many of us have to make sure that we're PCI compliant, for example, or HIPAA, FERPA, things, whatever the alphabet soup is, flavor of the month. But a lot of times we're kind of doing the bare minimum to make sure the policies are in place, or we're just checking the box. And what we need to start doing is thinking about how we're going to mature in each one of these areas. If something says to scan for vulnerabilities, are we just scanning to check the box to say that we've done the scan, or is there an SLA in place to make sure criticals are closed in the right amount of time? Dedicated staff have, the adequate resources to make sure that they do remediate them fully or mitigate any risks. So that's where we're trying to get kind of this new idea that make sure that we're also just dedicating the amount of time and resources to make sure that we can implement these policies in a mature manner. So getting back to the confidence areas, we can see here that most people are still somewhat confident or less with regard to what they're actually implementing with regard to security controls. And this is articulated again probably through the fact that we need additional resources in terms of staffing, hiring, training, tool configuration, things of that nature. Cool. So some other things that we saw as future considerations around this area, as we're building out more Internet of Things types devices, think about how we're implementing those into the business world. Some of those may be out of date, not get updates in terms of firmware. How are they connected to, configured? Are there default passwords if you're using in-house like security cameras, for example, or other Internet of Things types devices? So that's a big consideration as we see those ease of use in the consumer market. Those will likely make their way into the enterprise markets as well. And we need to consider how that's going to look from a security standpoint. Last year, we identified that the majority of the big breaches all correlated with some sort of patch management mishap or pitfall. So making sure that we have that regular patch deployment and auditing so we can identify that attack surface. So if we have patches critical that are coming out or need to be deployed, we need to understand like what's the turnaround time on that, what percentage is receiving that patch, make sure we can audit that and identify the nodes or systems that may not have received that yet so we can monitor it in a more secure, succinct manner. Something that's come up frequently in the recent news is this cloud configuration and management idea. And what we've noticed is various people are having trouble in that area, making sure that what they're doing when they move infrastructure to the cloud for high availability, how are we carving out that infrastructure? How are we securing it? How are we monitoring it as well? So those are definitely another consideration for how we're going to look at securing things in the future. And then the idea around behavior analyzation and anomaly detection. So as we do more security monitoring on our devices and your devices in client network, we want to understand what's normal behavior. What are the types of things? Does node A always connect to node B? What happens when it goes out of bands and does something that's considered anomalous, where maybe it never connects to another database or something of that nature? How do we go through and make sure that that's happening in a secure manner or as intended behavior? So without further ado, this kind of helped us boil down this infographic. We don't want to end up in the deep end without any sort of flotation device or idea of how to get around and navigate this big ocean of security. This helped us identify some of the key points within the security industry. So as we can get back to, I think I have a pointer here. Maybe not. So we have the idea that 0 to 5 full-time IT security staff, 74% of those companies surveyed only had 0 to 5 individuals kind of dedicated to security. As we have bigger companies, more complex networks, and we're integrating more devices, we're going to want to see that number go down, and we're going to want to see how we can address that, either with automation or outside services, or making sure that the people there are armed with the necessary resources in order to secure those networks or systems. Many still feel like they're underfunded. That kind of articulates the point that, while we're buying in at the policy level, we may need to continually work to display the correct data and the risks that are associated with some of the vulnerabilities we identify or gaps in technology, so that we can get more funding or more resources dedicated to hardening that area. So getting back to that idea that only about 15% of the companies surveyed felt like they were confident with their solutions. So we constantly want to look at, like, how are we mature within our compliant areas? Can we increase that maturity? Can we do more things? Again, getting back to security scanning or monitoring, can we expand our coverage? Can we identify different types of attacks, things of that nature? Over half the people believe that they have been breached so far. So in just the past year, more than half of the companies surveyed believe that they had been breached. So identifying how we can be more prompt and more punctual on those attacks, identifying indicators of attacks, and identifying like the weakest link in a chain of trust. If that's an endpoint, how can we identify some of those anomalous behaviors or things that are not normal behaviors for those nodes, and work to either segregate it or mitigate that type of attack from the get-go. 16% are very confident in their ability to protect customer data, which is good. But as we want to see more individuals feeling confident in that, I think that's kind of that knowledge and training area, where we need to make sure that what we're doing is supplying the correct information to not only those who are tasked with protecting that and implementing security strategies, but also those who operate within that area or are working on that customer data. Do they feel confident about it? Do they understand the security protocols that are in place to protect that data? The right side of the graph kind of helps articulate that we're still that budgetary area within cybersecurity. So again, the policy and the buy-ins happening, but not necessarily all of the resources are being allocated there. So we are seeing that 63% of the companies surveyed are doing some sort of training or security awareness. What we've noticed is that's a direct correlation between the number of kind of areas or PCI or kind of compliancy regulation areas that also require some sort of knowledge training around security. So we want to make sure that that's starting to become more mature. Since it says that we need to do some sort of awareness training, make sure that what we're delivering to those individuals is going to be meaningful. They understand what controls are in place, how we implement that in our environments, and how we're doing that to secure things like customer data. The big area that we've seen a lot of infiltration is around spam and phishing emails. So almost 25% have no formal awareness program around that top 5 concern within phishing and spam. So that might be an area where we include that type of information in our training and awareness. And then lastly, almost 50% of the organizations review the cybersecurity program with the board of directors. So that does show that we are getting more feedback from the high-level management in our companies with regard to how we're implementing security, what type of policies we have in place, making sure that least privilege access models and things like that are implemented, but still articulating above it that we need to make sure that we're allocating the necessary resources to help around this area. So I think that's my last slide there, and I know I saw a hand go up. Were there any questions, Trevin?
Great, thanks, Neil. Just a reminder that all attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you do have a question, please use the Q&A tab, and we'll answer them. It does look like we have one question so far. It says, how is liability handled when 2 or more companies share data, i.e. APIs or data transmission of sorts?
So typically there's some sort of service level agreement there with regard to that liability. It's going to be who owns that data or who is processing that. So like in the case of how we work with our clients at Cygilant is we have a lot of SIEM, vulnerability, and patch management data, which could be fruitful for a potential attacker. So what we talk around that area there is how we're managing that, and this is where our liability goes with regard to what might be available in that information, and then versus kind of where that line is drawn from the actual data itself, like if we're monitoring nodes that contain non-public information, perhaps what the actual exfiltration of that data versus the SIEM data that kind of goes around monitoring that particular node. So it's making sure that there's a good division of labor there, or a good division of the responsibilities will help with the liability, but then similarly, making sure that both sides understand how they're operating in a secure manner. And like if we're doing some sort of data transfer, are we doing it over secure channels? Make sure that we're adhering to the highest policy between the two.
Great, thanks, Neil. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and enter them into your Q&A tab. We'll hang on the line for just a couple minutes to give you time to enter them in. So we had a question, can we get this report? And if the answer is that the infographic is actually available on our website right now. If you go to Cygilant.com, it's under the resources tab with our other infographic from last year. Since there are no further questions, this will conclude today's session. I want to thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our speaker, Neil Weitzel.
Thanks, everyone.